the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project and Magnetic Reversal News. And my lovely hostess today is my partner, Leah Shaper. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
And those of you that were listening to the show last week, remember that we're concluding that Göbekli Tepe, perhaps, was an astronomical observatory being used to watch comets and other celestial objects, probably because it's being built right after the Younger Dryas catastrophe. So there can be some conclusions there. There are survivors from the Younger Dryas catastrophe on Earth, and they're gathering together in the Fertile Crescent near Turkey because maybe the hunting's good there, or maybe that it wasn't really affected there. And this is an advanced civilization that got decimated. So there's just a few survivors, but they were able to hold on to some amazing engineering, mathematical, astronomical information. And they were literally encoding it in the rock in the first library after the catastrophe on those hills. Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe. There's 11 or 12 sites now, less than 2% excavated in Turkey. And over the next few decades, if archaeology exists, what they will uncover there is going to be mind-blowing. What are your thoughts?
It's such an extraordinary area. I was thinking last night about how many sites there are in Turkey where you have caves and sort of underground cities, and these people are survivors. And I really believe that, they were providing the information for us to know what was coming going forward, or at least for their own people, if not, future generations. It's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, and there is an interesting twist, because I was just doing some research, and they've uncovered not only those tepes with these astronomical stone circles, they've uncovered more underground cities near Cappadocia. And similar to Derinkuyu, the city in Derinkuyu can hold up to 20,000 people. Many people aren't even allowed to go down into those areas. But the underground cities they found in Cappadocia, they found artifacts inside them. These are man-made underground tunnels that date back 16,000 years.
Wow. So
the people are probably digging the underground cities around the time of the Younger Dryas catastrophe or before, because this giant comet is whirling around and you're watching it for generations, and pieces are breaking off and hitting in the beginning, and it's getting closer and closer to you. And you're like, we got to go underground here. What if this hits? We're all doomed.
They were amazingly well prepared, which really speaks volumes. It's either because they saw it coming or because similar things had happened in the past and they had that knowledge.
Well, and based on the science we've been talking about for weeks, they knew things were coming. Things started hitting the Earth 40,000 years ago and flash freezing the mammoths in the mucks. And then it was happening 34,000 years ago. Then it happened 18,000 years ago. Then it happened at 12,009. So there were a sequence of events separated but just by a few thousand years of catastrophes beginning to happen on Earth. And maybe the population smartened up. They teamed up and they dug these underground cities to survive.
Yeah, I was thinking too, there must have been no doubt that this stuff was coming, because think about the prospect of living in an underground city with, let's say, 20,000 other people. It doesn't sound very appealing. It actually sounds kind of terrifying. So they must have been very convinced that this was coming. They knew it was coming, and they were right.
Yeah, it depends on when they were living there. If these were built, let's say during the late glacial maximum around 18,000 years ago, it would have been very cold on Earth. So it would make sense. You'd be like, sure, I'll sleep on the 11th floor down because it's going to be 54 degrees. You just could light a little fire or something.
Yeah. Well, also, last night I was also thinking about what happened to trigger the bowling alley rod, and we don't know what that is, right? I mean, I was reading the sort of the traditional narratives that explain it, that the AMOC suddenly started to shift and everything warmed up very quickly. It doesn't really make sense to me. It's like what happened was so abrupt.
This is
and
the
it's gotta
104.
be
This is the 104,000 year cycle, the warming at the bowling alley rod.
Yeah.
So it's a very big and it's something big. It's Rex and I did a show where I showed him the last 5 million years, the Pleistocene, and the temperature starts dropping. And at around 2.6 million years ago, we fall behind some hypothetical baseline where ice begins to build, and that's the Ice Age. So we've been in the Ice Age for 2.5 million years. For about 1.4 million years of it, the cycle of ice was 40,000 years, matching the obliquity of Earth. And then for some reason, recently, 400 to 800,000 years ago, that ice age cycle changed to 104,000 years.
Yeah.
And so whatever that mechanism is, no one has been able to explain it.
Right. And but then that huge spike that you get at 14,000 years ago with the bowling alley, something has to have caused that, right? It's either maybe a cometary interaction or a solar outburst, something like that.
Yeah,
so
because it's so regular, it's got to be the sun. You can't have a comet come by every 104,000 years, where prior it was coming by every 40,000. So there's something driving the dynamo in the sun that changed from a 40,000 year dynamo to a 104,000 year dynamo. Yeah.
I was also listening last night to the interview that Anders Bowling did with Robert Schoch, and I didn't realize that Robert Schoch doesn't believe in the comet impact hypothesis for the younger Dryas, which is interesting to me because it's very hard to explain. He believes in a solar outburst, but it's very hard to explain the Carolina Bays with a solar outburst. So maybe the evidence that he's looking at is really from the 14,000 year event and not from 12.9.
Yeah, I mean, he may suggest that a piece of plasma makes it to the surface and hits the ice sheet.
Sure. I mean, that's not impossible.
That seems... We don't have any evidence that material from the surface of the sun in some kind of a lava or something can hit the Earth.
Well, if it was a plasma interaction as a result of a solar outburst, that would make some sense, correct?
Well, the reason a lot of people hypothesized that we went to the moon back in the day was to find evidence that the sun explodes, and that's what they were looking for, glass.
Yeah.
And they found it. They found lots of glass. And so we find the same glass at the Younger Dryas event in the Atacama Desert and other types of things on that boundary. But because of things like platinum and other spikes, to totally discount impactors seems to be ludicrous.
Yeah, he seems to suggest that those other markers like iridium and whatnot could also be explained by a solar outburst. I don't know I can't say one way or the other myself. He didn't really get into the details of that, so.
Yeah, and then we have something else happening up in Alaska for every 40,000, 36,000, 18,000 years ago, causing catastrophes where animals die instantly and get placed in these catastrophic floods that fill the valleys. I mean, these aren't strange floods. They're very atypical, as if a tsunami washed everything up into these crevices, or some other major flooding event through heating of the ice, and a catastrophic flood emplacement where everything settles into the valley and then freezes overnight because it's in the Arctic. So it's only in that liquid state or slurry for a short period of time, and then it freezes. And they've remained frozen for the entirety of the time until now when they're being discovered. So it's probably something else than the sun, in my opinion, that that evidence is from things hitting the Arctic, objects, impactors.
Right. That was my issue with the Carolina Bay thing. I mean, the Carolina Bays clearly indicate an impact of some kind, in my opinion.
And I just a very specific point of impact, which wouldn't be like a solar plasma. It would be a rock.
Right. You have all of the bays that indicate a very specific directionality,
Yeah, they all go back to Saginaw Bay.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have that. We also have evidence of large-scale volcanism. Now, there's evidence that, I think we talked about it last week, that when the Chicxulub crater hit, because this is a similar event we're talking about, the Younger Dryas event is very similar to the extinction of the dinosaurs, in that something cosmogenic happened and multiple things happened. When Chicxulub hit, on the other side of the Earth, one of the largest volcanic eruptions occurred at the same time. And for a very long time before the impact hypothesis existed, they thought that it was the volcanic activity on the other side of the Earth that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs by toxifying the entire atmosphere. But now we know both things happened.
Right, right. Well, it's so hard to untease all of this evidence because so much of it is causal, like individual aspects are causally related to other aspects. So it's really hard to untangle and determine what the original primary cause was.
Exactly. It could all be the comet breaking up and interacting with the sun, causing the sun to outburst, causing pieces to hit Earth, changing the magnetic field of Earth. That's one thing we know that can happen.
Right.
These magnetic excursions can happen if a large enough object hits us. So objects hitting the Earth, a piece of the comet hits the sun has a super flare. That energy comes into the Earth and major volcanoes erupt. So that's the basic scenario here.
Yeah, yeah.
And at all this time, all of humanity is around the ocean with their cities, and sea level in the next few thousand years is about to come up 400 feet.
Yeah.
In 3 major events. And these are meltwater pulses. And the final event, the final meltwater pulse around 11,005 or 11,600 years ago is the sinking of Atlantis, which would be the very last vestige of our advanced civilization that got wiped out. That's the idea, right?
Right.
Now, many critics on Atlantis or of Atlantis insist that besides Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, which everyone uses, that there is no other independent evidence to suggest that Atlantis was actually anything other than a fairy tale.
Right.
Now, what do you think about that?
I mean, I have not done a thorough search for the evidence of Atlantis, but having been a student of philosophy, I have a hard time not believing that Plato was not being truthful.
Right. And in fact, there is probably 1,000 pages of sources, other sources of information that allude to Atlantis that I uncovered in just about 2 hours of digging.
Right.
And some of it is so specific and amazing, but the most specificity comes from Plato and Critias and Timaeus.
Yeah. Well, he has that wonderful description that is very helpful.
And I'm just going to read some of the Plato affirmation here from Critias, that the Atlantean kings inscribed in golden pillars in their laws, edicts, and judicial decisions in a strange ritual involving the sacrifice of a bull dedicated to Poseidon. Now, the bull motif is like some of the earliest religious motifs that we have pre-Christianity. We also know that the very bizarre about Minoans, almost all of their stela have this bull. So it's like connecting the Minoans, this unknown group of amazing people that were megalithic builders, by the way, 6,000 years ago. Directly, it links the Minoans directly to this story of Atlantis. Now, it may be where Plato got the idea for the fairy tale. Someone told him about the Minoans. He looked at some pictures of bulls, and he's got the story.
Yeah. I mean, he's not really a storyteller. You know, like I sort of take issue with that concept in and of itself.
Right.
It's possible.
Now let's talk about lost technology. Plato alludes to it. He tells how the walls of Atlantis were clad in gold, silver, and bronze, tin, and ore caulk. Now, ore caulk is an alloy of tin and bronze, which wasn't invented until about 3,000 years ago. So this is, and they're using it 12, 13, 14,000 years ago in Atlantis. So that's pretty interesting there.
Yeah.
And the sources of these metals, in particular tin, have never been adequately identified. The Kohltepe mines in Anatolia, imagine that, this is in Turkey. There's tin mines in Turkey. So this is directly connecting Göbekli Tepe to Atlantis through the tin mines. And there's also some small tin mines in Spain. But there is, listen to this, the legendary islands of tin called the Castidarides, which are an imaginary group of islands that no one has been able to locate off the coast of Europe. And that's where Atlantis is out there. So maybe
what is the name again?
Of the mythical place?
Yeah.
It's the Cassitterides, Castidarides.
Huh.
These mysterious islands were also referred to as the Tarshish, the Tartessos, or the Islands of Metal. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting things. Plato talks about the fact that there are seaports, navigation, and irrigation canals. And we can even share. Let's stop showing our faces. How about that? We can even share kind of a mock-up of what Plato's description of and then small communities living on those concentric rings there.
I think I missed a bunch of what you said. My things froze on my end.
Okay, sorry. One of the most
That's
fascinating features of Plato's Atlantis was the vast network of canals used for the double purpose of irrigating its extensive agricultural plains and for the fluvial transport of their produce to and from. The capital of the Atlantean Empire was crossed and surrounded by these canals, forming a figure known as the Celtic cross.
Huh.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, this symbol is often confused with that of the earth or even the sun, but it indeed originally applied to, as in ancient Egypt, paradise. And here it is Atlantis. Now, according to Plato, the network of canals contained dams and sluice gates to control the flow of the rivers, and it was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, the likes of which are only attested to in the ancient Far East and to a lesser scale in Incan America. Moreover, Plato specifically states that Atlantis was a great naval power, similar to the Minoans and all of these other groups that rose up a few thousand years ago from the sea. Even a group of the Sea Peoples. You've heard of those, right?
No, actually, I haven't.
Many people talk about even the Egyptians, the Sea Peoples coming to battle them. And this would be a naval society, which they're talking about here is Atlantis.
Yeah.
Now, the Incas of Peru had great naval ability. And there's ample evidence confirmed by Thor Heyerdahl and his Kon-Tiki expedition that they made routine contacts with the Far East via the Pacific Ocean. Now, there's even more very interesting things that lead me to believe that the megalithic builders in South America were either directly linked to the Atlanteans or are the Atlanteans. And that Atlantis might have been a city, but the Atlanteans may have lived all over the world in those low-lying areas that are now 400 feet underwater. And some of that is in Indonesia, which is Sundaland, which is literally a continent size area that has been sunk in just the last 12,000 years because of the rising sea levels.
Mhm.
So I think the Atlanteans could be all over the planet. And that could be a missing piece of the puzzle. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, well, you and I have sort of floated this idea that it's almost as if Atlantis is kind of like the global capital of the world, right? And that we have a civilization that is seafaring, and we have things going on Easter Island. We have Gobekli Tepe. We have the Indonesians. It's as if it's all connected, and it's hard to think that it's not, because, and I think we'll get into this in another show, we see parallels between what was going on Easter Island and Gobekli Tepe, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we're going to go over the backs of the Moai and how they look very similar to Pillar 43 in Gobekli Tepe, which means that those cultures are probably contemporaneous, not separated by 10,500 years, as archaeology suggests.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like there's a global concept, and then people are taking it to their individual locations and filtering it through their own culture, and they come up with their own carvings, but there's certain elements of those carvings that keep repeating. And it's really hard to deny that there's not a relationship there.
In the second half of today's show, we'll go over the claims that the Richat structure is Atlantis and a bunch of the evidence why that probably is not true. But let's get to another really interesting point of Atlantis that Plato makes, is that not only do we describe the canals, the waterways, there were a great number of elephants on the island, and this is very specific.
Yeah.
Now, the elephants are in very few places in the modern world. And what a lot of people fail to miss, and the ones that are trying to put Atlantis in Africa because elephants are there, is that North and South America had hundreds of millions of elephants prior to the Young Dryas event. They're called mammoths.
Right.
And there weren't just mammoths. There were almost a dozen species of different elephants, mastodons, hairy ones with tusks, ones without. There were probably varieties you could tame and ride.
Sure.
Yeah, just like they do with modern elephants.
Sure.
So then Atlantis can be almost anywhere before the Younger Dryas, because mammoths were pretty much they're all over the world.
Yeah. Well,
so it doesn't, go ahead.
No, I was thinking about this morning, is the elephants myself, and if Atlantis is where the Azores are now, so that's my only question is how did the elephants get there? I mean, maybe they were there at a time when the Azores was more continentally connected.
Well, take a look at this. Is the one of two maps of Atlantis. Look at how big it is.
Yeah.
And it's upside down. So north is see where north is to the bottom? Yeah. So flip it, and you get the Straits of Gibraltar over on the left side there between Spain and Africa. And then you get Atlantis in the middle. Then you get America over here.
Yeah.
So it's huge. So if there was a massive continent there, of course there would have been mammoth.
Yeah.
There were mammoths throughout Siberia, North America, Europe, on islands up in the Arctic Circle. I mean, for goodness sakes, there were the last mammoths died out in Siberia 4,500 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really ancient species, right? Because we find elephants, mastodons, all of that, mammoths all over the world.
Yeah, and here's an interesting other depiction I found.
That is interesting, because Plato does talk about, there being like an island chain, right? Sort of on the way to Atlantis, and you see that on both sides in this map. Where does this map come from?
No idea. The internet.
Yeah. Like, did somebody just draw it based on description?
I could reverse search it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are lots of people who've been talking about Atlantis for 100 years. I mean, Ignatius Donnelly. And, actually, ancient worldwide legends of this event have been around forever. And I've got the book here by Ignatius Donnelly, Ancient Worldwide Legends of the Comet. And so And, it all culminates, the science all came together here with the cycles of cosmic catastrophe by Firestone, literally proving that an event happened that could have sunk Atlantis. So this was like the first time recently that the reason all this Atlantis lore is back into the forefront is because science is proving it.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the recap structure, maybe in some elephants after the break.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
There have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
I'm aware of some archaeologists that have uncovered large bones indicating giants in Virginia. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down and
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford. Join me every Thursday night in Studio A at 6 p.m. Eastern for Factor Theory Live. Find us on www.revolution.radio. Great guests and great stories. What do you believe?
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Awesome. I love our audience. They are
Never fails to amuse you.
Yep. All right. There is so much information I have drawn up here about Atlantis in myth and legend that we barely touched the surface. It's like that for 30 minutes went quick. There's one interesting piece. I want to bring it all together because, like I suggested, that there was advanced civilization everywhere prior to this. Plato alludes to it. He affirms that one of the main features of Atlantis was the nature and intensity of its naval commerce with even the most distant nations of the world. So we don't know about any nations prior to the Younger Dryas event, but we do see the remnants in megalithic structures that are just fragments of it. And we could bring up some pictures of that. We wanted to talk about that, but we'll do that at a later show. The capital of the Atlantean Empire was crossed by maritime canals, which allowed the ingress of the largest ships on Earth and allowed their dockings in its port facilities. Plato asserts that because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to the Atlanteans from foreign countries. Through the land itself provided most of what was required for them in their life. Obviously, there were other goods that were useful. Plato also further adds in Critias that the canals and the largest harbors of the capital city were full of ships and merchants coming from all parts of the world, who from their large numbers kept a multitudinous rumor of human voices and a din and clatter of all sorts, both day and night. That's crazy.
It very much sounds like the modern world, doesn't it?
The
like
modern world got
major
erased.
Modern port.
It's amazing. It's got erased.
Yeah.
You keep doing the same thing over and over again.
I was just thinking last night about, we have the standard narrative, right, is that civilization essentially began like 6,000 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, actually, no wonder we want to think that, because something major happened that wiped most of civilization out and we had to start over. And that's what we found. So that's what we believe. But actually, there was all this other stuff going on 12,000 years ago and earlier.
And there are a lot of the cultures that have their different mythologies, maybe talking about the other countries that were around that were going into the Atlantis' harbor, because clearly there's other cities all around the world. In fact, Homer's Phaeacia or Scheria, which is another name, is a mythical continent that is in the Indian Ocean, referred to by Homer as the Winey Red Ocean.
The
Phaeacia, go ahead.
Winey Red Ocean?
W-I-N-Y, Winey Red. Yeah. So in Homer's own words, the splendor of the palace was like that of the sun and the moon. Homer also affirms that the Phaeacians are a seafaring nation and sail all seas by the grace of Poseidon. Its ships fleet like thought or as a bird in the air. So it's a naval. We had a huge maritime civilization prior to these catastrophes all over the world.
Yep.
This is attesting to just how destructive that few thousand years really was, that it literally, like a Brillo pad, erased the entire Earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's absolutely.
And what we have left is, there's stuff left, right? We have all of these megalithic structures that are left that we can't explain how they were built. Not well, anyway. We really don't know how they were built. That's what's left.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. And so, like the Mayans and the Aztecs, they got their information from this advanced civilization. In the past, they are the descendants of them. They're the survivors that made it in South America. And
Yeah.
it took that many generations. It took thousands of years for them to rebuild the empires that we're now discovering using LiDAR.
Yeah.
I mean, these are advanced cultures 5,000 years ago in the jungles building 16-foot elevated causeways that then he didn't have the wheel.
Yeah, this whole thing about the wheel just absolutely cracks me up. We talk about the wheel like it's some amazing, extraordinary idea of the human mind, where it's like you can look anywhere in nature and find a circle, and lo and behold, it rolls. Like, it's really not that hard to come up with that. And that we say that we invented the wheel, like, what is it, 6,000 years ago? It's so stupid.
5,800. Yep.
It's so dumb.
But 13,000 years ago, there were navies.
Yeah. But it took us another almost 7,000 years to invent the wheel. Okay.
Yeah. So I think Atlantis is just one of the sunken continents. It was in the middle of Atlantis. There was also huge amounts of continents sunk near India, and that could be Homer's Phaeacia, a different city. And then you have Sundaland in Indonesia, that huge continental area that's sunk also at the end of the last ice age. Sundaland had its own empire. So, and they all had naval fleets, and they're all moving around the oceans and they're trading stuff.
Right. Well, and then think about, like, if you've got a global civilization, a global maritime civilization, obviously it would have taken a long time to develop that and people trading ideas and knowledge. So, like, what was going on before that, right? Because clearly civilization was around well before we developed maritime cultures.
Yeah, they didn't just wake up and make a fleet of ships.
Right. And everybody happened to do it all at the same time around the world.
Well, the interesting thing is that prior to the Younger Dryas event, there's really no catastrophes for a very long period of time. So there's ample time to develop this.
Right, right.
It would literally be developed from, let's say, 41,000 years ago to the Younger Dryas event, because in 41,000, we have the Lechamp magnetic excursion and very bad things happen on Earth, another mass extinction. So probably between that time period, between 40,000 and the Younger Dryas, and that's when we have the oldest cave art and all that stuff. There's nothing really older than that suggests we were advanced.
Yeah. Well, and to think that there was such a long time span of uninterrupted human civilization, like, what else did we come up with that we don't know about, that we wouldn't even be able to explain now? And that's a long time.
We've only been uninterrupted now, what, like 6,000 years?
Right.
We've been interrupted. We've had a dark age and bad stuff happens, but the Earth didn't get erased yet.
Right.
So back then they had about almost 30,000 years. That's a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what kind of technologies did they evolve? Wow.
Right.
Here's another map showing Atlantis out there in the middle of the ocean.
Well, okay, so then what do you say? Can you go back to the previous picture? What do you say to the people who insist that Atlantis is the Richat structure because of that Lake Sahara that's drawn in this image? Because people will say, go ahead.
Lake Sahara is really Mega Lake Chad. And it didn't extend to the Richat structure.
Okay.
And plus, the Richat structure is currently at the lowest elevation is 400 feet above sea level. And if you melt all the ice on the Earth, the ocean still doesn't reach the Richat structure.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you only can get another 210 feet of sea level rise if we were to melt all the rest of the ice.
Right.
So you'd still be 200 feet above sea level at the Richat structure. Hard to bring a ship there.
Yes.
The other problem is the Richat structure, in my opinion, I have Google Earth up, was only exposed during the tsunami that washed over Africa during the Younger Dryas catastrophe. So this was underground and not even exposed. This is a very old geologic feature. It's an erosional uplift dome. You can even see a smaller one to the left here.
Yeah. And this is millions of years old, correct?
Yes, tens of millions. Tens of millions of years ago, a granitic body was swelling up in the earth here and then solidified. So it never really exploded. There's some fissure dikes. There's all kind of volcanic rocks coming up in cracks in here. And that's because at the central core is a granitic dome. So a bubble of lava came up, formed a welt on Earth, and then it got weathered off. Tens of millions of years ago, and then it got covered over by flat sedimentary rock, which is the yellow stuff everywhere.
You know,
go ahead.
I read an account of somebody who, got a visa and a tour guide to go check out the Richat structure, and it's kind of hilarious because so he tracked their journey on GPS, and the tour guide couldn't find it, and he couldn't find it because it's from up above it looks incredible, but on the surface it's like standing next to a crop circle. You can't really see anything. And so there's these photos of the guide basically standing in the middle of the desert, and it doesn't really look like anything. And they thought that they never found it, but when he went back and he looked at his GPS, they were driving right over it. So it's kind of funny.
It's not easy to get to. It's like hours and hours away from anything.
Yeah. This is not.
It's also in Mauritania, which you basically could be murdered at any moment.
Right. Well, and I was reading, the people who believe that Atlantis was the Richat structure, and they're, saying why is nobody doing the archaeological digging or anything? And it's like, A, there is a perfectly good geological explanation, but B, like you said, it's very hard to get to. This is
there are a couple people that went out here that have a lot of money, YouTubers. There's a lot of YouTubers that are rich kids that get a good quick following because they just travel around everywhere. A couple of them have been in here, and there are some archaeological sites in here, but it's like mud huts, little stone huts, couple of them.
Yeah.
Basically nothing.
Right.
And to have an advanced civilization, you'd have some remnants.
Yeah, I saw a forum as well this morning of people claiming that they see structures, and they're viewing this from Google Earth, and it's like, sorry, but when you look at things on Google Earth, it can be very deceiving. It's the same thing. It's this looks very different than it would at the ground level, and I could not see from any of the photos that were provided how you would be able to distinguish a rock from a buried structure.
Right. Another problem is that these aren't canals. These are sedimentary rock layers tilted at an angle. So they're not canals. They're natural sedimentary rock layers tilting at an angle. You can even see the angle they're tilting at.
Yeah.
And also, they don't hold water. There's cracks everywhere. The whole structure slopes to the west, and any water that would come in here flows out of these channels to the west.
Yeah.
Okay, so like here at Makshem El Khalef. This is one of the outflow channels.
Yeah.
Another problem is that this is probably an erosional feature from the Younger Dryas catastrophe, because you can see the linear features here.
Yeah.
This is the wash up and then the wash out direction. This giant gash is in the linear direction of this, and it has an inlet channel here. It has a perfectly circular cutback, which is from a mega waterfall. This is the same exact thing as what Niagara Falls looks like. So this is a main waterfall and caused this hole to scour back to this point until the water stopped flowing.
Yeah.
So this is a very recent erosional feature, probably from the Younger Dryas catastrophe, probably from the impact on the ice sheet that formed the Carolina Bays. And then subsequently, we discussed it, the continental shelf collapses, and a sequence of tsunamis swash from Africa to America back and forth over a 24-hour period, and the Richat structure gets exposed.
So oh man, the Atlantis Richat structured people are going to hate us.
Yeah.
They already do, but...
So you can add all the things that might on the Atlantis checklist in this part of Africa. There's elephants here, right? The rocks were red, white, and black, I think. And the rocks here appear to be black and red and buff. I don't see much white.
Right.
But it's a stretch.
Sure. You could call like sandstones white or something.
There's some black in here.
Sure.
Not a lot of red in the recat structure. But I think that they were talking about the buildings, not the sedimentary rocks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's pretty weird.
Yeah. Well, and of course, people also, they'll cite the number of concentric canals.
Yeah.
That, happens to potentially match.
No, it doesn't. You can count as hundreds of rings here. You can
I would agree with that.
You can make anything up.
Right. Right. Right.
And the fact that it's an uplift dome and there's no evidence at all of a city is 100% evidence that this probably wasn't Atlantis.
Well, also, this geologically, it is millions of years old, right? Like that you cannot debate. So I don't see a reason why someone would choose to build their city specifically on a geologic formation like this. Like, what's the point?
Yeah. And Jimmy from Bright Insight, who is really perpetuating this fraud because he's got millions of viewers, was even on Joe Rogan and misspoke a bunch of times about lots of his claims. He says, there's mountains to the north of the recat structure. No, there isn't. This is a plateau. This is not a mount. It goes up to this flat plain. There's no mountains to the north unless you want to call these small rock outcrops mountains.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, there's no mountains to the north. 12,000 years ago, this would actually be 800 feet above sea level because sea level would be even further off. This is see the continental shelf out here? That would be the edge of Africa, all the way out here.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence of canals or any way to get from the ocean to the recat structure. What there is evidence that huge water erosion recently exposed this. That's what there is evidence for.
Yeah, and that's also very hard to deny.
Right, because we have the African humid period, and this was made famous by Robert Schoch, and the water erosion around the Sphinx enclosure. The northern part of Africa used to be wet. And in fact, it was only wet for a very specific period of time. It began being wet 14,500 years ago and ended about 6,000 years ago. So that's the only time northern Africa in recent 100,000 plus years was wet. And it was during the Younger Dryas catastrophe.
And I think would have to presume that Atlantis would have to be older than 14,000 years.
Absolutely.
Don't you think?
Yeah. And so people started panicking during the Bowling Alarod warming 14,500 years ago, which happens to exactly coincide with the African humid period.
Right.
Same exact date. So sea level's rising and the earth is raining. And people are panicking. Cities are going underwater. So they start to go to high ground and dig underground cities. Cappadocia, Derinkuyu. They think they may all be, I don't know, washed away. The objects could start hitting the earth at this period of time prior to the Younger Dryas event, which then wipes out everybody. The whole world.
It's like just being a regular person. Let's say you're a regular person living at 13.5. Something has already happened at 14,000 years ago to bring the temperature of Earth way up. It starts raining like crazy. Potentially you have stuff hitting Earth. And then this just continues to go on and on all the way up to 12.9 at least. And it's like, imagine generations of people and the stories that they must be telling their children about what it's like to live on Earth. It's got to be totally nuts. Of course, you're living underground if you can.
Yeah, so here's how big Mega Lake Chad would be.
Yeah.
No, that's the current Lake Chad. The Mega Lake Chad would be just slightly bigger. See my cursor? Even if we make this lake 1,000 times bigger, it's still 1,000 miles away from the recat structure.
Yeah.
And it's landlocked.
Yeah.
Now,
that's an obvious problem.
Well, you saw the one Atlantis map where there was an ocean entrance here. to the
Right,
east.
through the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that actually did exist for a short period of time, but still does not get you over to the Richat structure.
Well, and it probably didn't exist before 14,000 years ago either.
No, because sea level was way down.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was only a recent phenomenon during that humid period.
Yeah.
Tons of rain falling, this lake is growing and growing, and then it connects with the ocean. That's all that happened.
Right.
And now it doesn't. It's all dried up. You can see how much it's dried up in just 40 years. The big blue here was 1972. The current size is tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this baby's going to dry up in a few 100 years. Won't even be a Lake Chad.
That's interesting in this particular map that they're attributing this to overuse of the lake.
Yeah, it's the middle of the desert. Everyone's using that water.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't quite understand what they meant by that.
Yeah, it's up in the desert still. It's right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So nothing growing up there. They're just sucking it dry.
Yeah.
So there's the problem with Lake Chad. Jimmy also points to salt deposits here over in Eastern Africa, but that's because Lake Chad connected to the Mediterranean and salt water was once there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's dried up. That's why there's salt deposits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not a lot of salt deposits around the Richat structure.
No.
No, because it's deep exposed bedrock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's no evidence that there was seawater inside of that valley where the Richat structure is, except for during a massive catastrophe during the Younger Dryas, which created all these linear features here.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
And you can even see where it all washed straight out here.
Yeah. This is like looking at those coastline areas where you can see the evidence of massive tsunami.
Exactly. Only this is just massive water flowing over all of North Africa.
Yeah.
And so the picture that we painted was simple, that the continental shelves were getting obliterated here with ice chunks. They collapse. They send massive tsunami exactly to the Richat structure. It washes up and off. And then on the off wash, it causes the West Sahara continental shelf to collapse and send a tsunami back our way.
Right.
And then it's sloshing back and forth for like 24 hours.
It's like a giant bathtub.
And if this was Atlantis, which you can clearly see the huge triangular plateau here.
Yeah.
And the mid-ocean ridge was dropping during the catastrophe. It doesn't even have to drop. If there are massive tsunamis washing back and forth here, everything is going to be obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But clearly it did sink in some way, or sea level came up.
1,000 feet underwater now.
Right.
And it's interesting. The first area you get to, there's this nice circular feature. So this could have been where Atlantis was, and it's huge mountains to the north, which is what the islands sticking up are.
Mm-hmm.
This is the lighthouse. You come into the harbor here.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the central city. This is where you should be diving. Right there, that platform.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the pyramids. Yeah, so
it's really hard to pick things out off the seafloor when you're using Google Maps. I mean, if you spend some time,
maps now where you can go get them, which are seafloor maps, new ones.
Oh,
yeah,
that'd be interesting to look at. Because, like, say for example, if you look in the Mediterranean and you look at the seafloor, it really looks like there's all kinds of ports and roads and all kinds of stuff.
Oh, down here,
have been submerged.
There's a grid pattern.
There is in some places. It's very interesting. But it's like, I don't conclude anything from that because I'm looking at a two-dimensional image from way above. It's really hard to know exactly what I'm looking at. But there's a lot of stuff that's fairly suspicious.
Yeah, we're looking.
And there's a lot of coastline that's underwater. So
what are all these holes?
Possible. Oh, what are those? I never noticed those before.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, and of course, as a species, we always gravitate towards the coastline. So it's really, it makes perfect sense to assume that there are some underwater structures out on the coastlines.
Oh, and just for fun, let's bring us into an enigma here. One of our projects, and hopefully we'll be getting out here in the early summer of next year to confirm what all of these unknown geoglyphs are surrounding these X-shaped ponds, where clearly you can see that's an ear of corn, that's a rabbit, and these are other animals.
So interesting.
Yeah. The world is an interesting place. Thanks for joining us, guys. Great show, and we will see you next week with more Cosmic Catastrophe. Bye.
Bye.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.